Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. The story I'm about to share with you unfolded about 6 months ago. I hesitated for a long time before deciding to open up about it. But it's crucial we do. We need to realize that the things we think only happen to others can happen to us too. The world is full of unpredictable people, and we must always stay vigilant. It was a late autumn evening, and the house was eerily quiet. My wife was away for a conference, and our 2 kids were with my in-laws for the weekend. The solitude was both strange and oddly thrilling. I hadn't had the house to myself in years, and I relished the peace. After dinner, I decided to unwind with a movie. I chose something light-hearted, hoping to fill the house with cheerful sounds. As the film played, I sank into relaxation, enjoying the rare tranquility. Halfway through, I decided to make myself a cup of tea. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed the back door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it earlier, and a chill of unease crept in. I brushed it off as forgetfulness, locked the door again, and went back to the living room with my tea. Despite my best efforts, I struggled to focus on the movie. My mind kept wandering back to that unlocked door. Was I really that absent-minded? I tried to ignore it, but the unease lingered. To some, it might seem excessive to worry about an open door, but I've always been meticulous about these things. We live in an isolated area, and while it's not particularly dangerous, crimes do occur. My parents' house was burglarized when I was younger, and I still remember the shattered sense of security. Since then, I've been extra cautious with doors and windows. Eventually, I turned off the TV and decided to call it a night. As I moved through the house, turning off lights and checking doors, I felt a strange urge to look out the windows. Each time, I half expected to see someone watching me, but the yard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Upstairs, I prepared for bed, but the feeling of unease persisted. I left a lamp on in the hallway, something I hadn't done since we first moved in. I climbed into bed, tried to read, but my mind raced, unable to focus on the words. Then, in the darkness, I heard it. A faint noise from downstairs. It was barely perceptible, but in the stillness, it was jarring. My heart raced and I strained to hear it again. There it was, a soft thud followed by a creak. I told myself it was just the house settling, but a part of me wasn't convinced. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I grabbed a small pocket knife from the bedside table and started to make my way down the stairs. The living room was just as I'd left it. I moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen, dining room, and bathroom were empty. I checked the back door again. It was still locked. But as I approached the front of the house, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I'd locked it. I stepped closer, my breath catching. Someone had been, or was still, inside. The door had a security mechanism that could only be opened from the inside. Without thinking, I opened the door, bracing for an intruder, but there was no one. I quickly went to the kitchen, grabbed a larger knife, and shouted into the emptiness that I was armed, and wouldn't hesitate to defend myself. I checked every room, meticulously scanning every corner. Returning to the bedroom where I'd left my phone, I was about to call 911 when I heard another noise, a distinct metallic sound coming from the garage. It sounded like something being moved. I sat up, listening closely. The garage was accessible through a door in the kitchen. Hadn't I checked it earlier? I was sure I had, but in the heat of the moment, I began to doubt myself. I slipped out of the bedroom again, flashlight in hand, and made my way downstairs. In the kitchen, I stood by the garage door listening. Silence. I slowly turned the knob and opened the door, shining my light into the darkness. The garage was cluttered as usual, boxes, tools, bikes. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I stepped inside, the cool air surrounding me. I scanned the room with my light, half expecting someone to be hiding. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered on. I jumped, my heart racing, and realized the motion sensor had been triggered by my movement. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor, a small folded piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Opening it, I read the note. "You should lock your doors." A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here, close enough to leave a note, yet I had seen no one. Panic surged through me. I needed to call the police. I ran back to the kitchen, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911. As I spoke to the operator, fear and frustration mingled. They assured me an officer would come, but I knew it would take time. I stayed on the line, moving through the house, checking every lock and window. Despite the operator's reassurances, I felt exposed and vulnerable. When the police finally arrived, relief washed over me. I let them in, explained everything, and showed them the note. They searched the house and surrounding area but found no one. The officer was sympathetic but could only file a report and increase patrols. I spent the rest of the night obsessing over what had happened. Nothing had been stolen, no direct interaction with me. Was it a warning? The thought of someone invading our privacy without taking anything concrete was terrifying. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I couldn't stay at the house alone. I arranged for a security system with cameras and alarms. It provided some peace of mind, but the sense of safety I once had was shattered. Life gradually returned to normalcy. My wife and kids came home, filling the house with noise and activity again. But the memory of that night lingered. I found myself double-checking locks and listening to every creak. The police never identified the note's author, and no further incidents occurred. But the experience left its mark. I had always prided myself on being level-headed, but that night revealed how quickly fear can take hold. It was a lesson in vigilance, a stark reminder of the fragility of the safety we often take for granted. Now, as I sit in the living room with my family's comforting sounds around me, I can't help but glance at the windows, checking for shadows that don't belong. The fear has faded, but the awareness remains. I know I'll never forget that night, the feeling of vulnerability and the reminder that safety is never something we can truly take for granted. In the summer of 2006, I found myself alone at my family's farmhouse. As night fell, I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. The nightmare began with a single, chilling sound. Footsteps outside the window. My parents were away, enjoying a trip out of town, and I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to unwind and reconnect with my roots. The farmhouse, nestled deep in the countryside, was far from the nearest town, surrounded by endless fields and a dense, shadowy forest. It was an old, creaky building that had been in our family for generations, but it was home to me. I arrived at the farmhouse just before dusk. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows over the fields. I parked my car and took a moment to savor the crisp country air. There was something comforting about the solitude, a stark contrast to the noisy city life I was used to. I carried my bags inside, locked the door behind me, and felt a peaceful calm wash over me as I settled into the house. I cooked a simple dinner, savoring the quiet as I ate at the kitchen table. The sky grew darker, and soon the farmhouse was enveloped in the pitch black of night. I turned on a few lamps and decided to relax in the living room with a book. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the wind outside and the creaks of the old house settling into the night. As I read, I began to notice strange noises, soft, irregular sounds that seemed out of place. At first I thought it was just the house's natural groans or the wind causing the shutters to rattle, but then I heard something more distinct, footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to dismiss it as an animal or my imagination playing tricks on me, but the noises persisted. The footsteps seemed to move around the house, starting and stopping. I put down my book, my unease growing. I moved to the window and peered out through the curtains, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. I told myself it was nothing, but I decided to check the back door anyway. As I walked into the hallway, I noticed muddy footprints on the floor leading from the back door to the living room. My heart raced. Someone had been inside. I quickly checked the back door. It was locked. How could someone have gotten in? I felt a shiver run down my spine. I remembered that we had security cameras around the property. I dashed to the study where the security monitor was and turned it on, my hands trembling. The screen flickered to life, showing various angles of the farmhouse. At first, everything looked normal. Empty fields and dark forest. But then, on one camera, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, completely still. My blood turned to ice. The figure was wearing a mask and seemed to be watching the house. I switched to another camera and the figure was now moving closer. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The farmhouse was too remote. I was alone. I had to act quickly. I locked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I found a heavy metal flashlight and held it tightly, feeling a bit more confident. I turned off the lights in the living room, hoping the darkness outside would conceal me from the intruder. I crouched behind the sofa, peeking out occasionally. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I kept checking the security monitor, watching the figure get closer and closer. Finally, the figure reached the back door. I held my breath as I saw the handle turn and the door creak open. I had been sure I locked it. The figure stepped inside, moving with unnerving silence. I remembered there was a back exit in the basement. If I could reach it, I might escape and find help. I moved quietly to the basement door, opened it slowly, and slipped inside. The basement was dark and cold. I fumbled for the light switch but decided against it. The darkness was my ally now. I felt my way along the walls to the back exit. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. The intruder was coming after me. I quickened my pace, but when I reached the back exit, I found it was locked from the outside. I was trapped. I needed a hiding spot. I saw an old wardrobe in the corner and quickly climbed inside, closing the door behind me. I tried to control my breathing, listening for any sound. The basement door creaked open, and the intruder's footsteps entered the room. I could hear them moving around, searching. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours. The footsteps came closer, stopping right in front of the wardrobe. I could see the shadow of the figure through the crack in the door. Just as I thought I was doomed, a loud bang came from upstairs. The figure froze, then quickly ran back up the stairs. I waited in the dark, my heart pounding, until the footsteps faded away. I stayed hidden for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. When I was sure the intruder was gone, I cautiously climbed out of the wardrobe and went back upstairs. The house was eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I found my phone and saw that the signal was back. I called the police and told them everything. They arrived quickly, searched the house and the surrounding area, but the intruder was gone. The police told me I was lucky to be unharmed and advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. I agreed, grabbed my things, and left the farmhouse without looking back. That night changed everything. The farmhouse, once a place of comfort, now felt like a haunting ground. The thought of the masked figure watching me still chills me to this day. I learned to always be aware of my surroundings and trust my instincts, a lesson I will never forget. When I was younger, I lived in southern England, sharing a house with a couple of friends. Our home was situated in a quiet suburb, surrounded by the tranquil English countryside and sprawling farmlands. For the first 3 months, everything was perfectly ordinary. The house was comfortable, and we had no issues with the neighbors. But after Christmas, things started to change, becoming more unsettling by the day. It began subtly, just small, odd occurrences. I'd hear my name being called, even though I was completely alone in the house. Sometimes there would be strange creaks and knocks echoing through the rooms. At first, I dismissed these incidents, chalking them up to the stress of my studies and the quirks of an old house adjusting to the cold winter weather. But as time passed, these incidents escalated, growing from eerie noises to more disturbing, tangible events. One morning, I couldn't find my keys. I searched my entire bedroom, combing through drawers and the wardrobe, but they were nowhere to be found. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and grab something to eat in the kitchen. As I left my room, I was startled to find my keys sitting on the windowsill next to the staircase. It made no sense. How could they have ended up outside my locked bedroom? I distinctly remembered placing them on my desk the night before, just before securing the latch on my bedroom door and going to bed. I hadn't left the room since. This baffling event happened multiple times. Each time I would find my keys on that same windowsill, and each time I grew more uneasy. Around the same period, our neighbor started behaving oddly. Whenever she spoke to us, she would shout, not in anger, but as if trying to be heard over a great distance or through a storm, despite the peacefulness around us. Her behavior was puzzling because I had seen her converse with others at a normal volume, yet she reserved her loudest voice for us, as though trying to communicate something urgent or ominous. As if that wasn't strange enough, foxes began frequenting our backyard. They dug large holes under the fence, chewed at the weakest spots, and left foul-smelling droppings and urine all along the fence line. Our backyard, a barren stretch of gravel with a small sun deck, had no appeal for wildlife, unlike our neighbor's lush garden filled with plants, chickens, and bird baths. Yet her garden remained untouched by the foxes. It seemed as though something was drawing the animals to our property, something we couldn't see. Inside the house, things only got worse. Our Wi-Fi, which had worked flawlessly before Christmas, began malfunctioning. The signal would randomly drop, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, with no apparent cause. A technician from the network provider couldn't find any issues, leaving us with no explanation. The lights in the house also began to act up. They would flicker erratically before burning out, and no matter how often I replaced the bulbs, the problem persisted. I spent a small fortune on light bulbs, yet the issue never resolved. Then there was the backyard door. We always made sure it was securely locked, but more and more often we would find it ajar, as if someone or something had opened it. None of us had gone near that room for days, yet the door refused to stay shut. Around this time, my friends began noticing something even more unsettling, a shadowy figure appearing in our backyard at night. They described it as a tall, bulky silhouette, entirely black and featureless, standing silently at the far end of the yard, staring at the house. Even when they turned on the lights, the figure remained, unmoving and eerie. Yet when one of my friends finally mustered the courage to confront the intruder, they found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed gravel, no sign that anyone had been there. But the figure would return, night after night, always in the same spot, always watching. Feeling increasingly desperate, I considered asking the prior of the church I attended to bless the house. But before I could act on that thought, I stumbled upon a YouTube video about traditional English folklore. One creature mentioned in the video caught my attention, a brownie, a small house spirit that, according to legend, inhabits homes across the British Isles. Brownies are said to protect the house and its inhabitants, but if they are neglected or displeased, they can cause mischief and chaos. To keep a brownie happy, one must leave offerings of food and drink, particularly sweets and honey, in a special place within the house. Deciding it was worth a try, I purchased honey, eggs, syrup, cordial, and sweets during my next grocery run. I found a spot on top of the kitchen cabinets where no one would disturb the offerings, and placed the items there. As I set everything in place, I murmured a few words to the unseen spirit, hoping it would accept my gesture of goodwill. The change was almost immediate. The atmosphere in the house felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The air seemed fresher, and even the rooms looked brighter. And most astonishing of all, the disturbances ceased. No more misplaced keys, no more shouting neighbor, no more foxes, no Wi-Fi issues, no flickering lights, no mysterious door openings, and no shadowy figure in the backyard. For a month, peace returned to our home. But then I began to hear my name whispered once more, a disembodied voice calling out to me. Remembering the brownie, I quickly cleaned the spot on the cabinet and replaced the offerings with fresh ones. I kept up this practice regularly until the day I moved out years later. I never told my friends about the offerings or the strange occurrences, and I don't know if the current tenants have continued to appease the brownie. I only hope that Mr. Brownie never made anyone's life as unsettling as it made ours before I discovered the simple solution to keep it content. My name is Samuel Patterson, and I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I was 27 when this incident happened to me. I was driving from Boston to the small town of Danvers, a trip I had made countless times. Little did I know that this routine journey would lead me to one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was a chilly evening in late October, and I was on my way to visit an old friend who lived in Danvers. The sky was overcast, and a dense fog was rolling in, making the drive through the winding roads even more eerie. As I navigated the familiar route, my car's headlights caught a glimpse of a decaying structure on the side of the road. I had heard rumors about the old Danvers State Hospital, an abandoned asylum that was infamous for its dark history and alleged hauntings. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a detour to explore the place. The main gate was ajar, as if inviting me in. I parked my car a short distance away and walked towards the imposing Gothic building. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. As I approached the entrance, a sense of dread washed over me, but I brushed it aside, attributing it to the eerie atmosphere. The front doors were surprisingly easy to open, creaking loudly as they swung inward. The interior was a labyrinth of dark hallways, peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. I pulled out my flashlight and began to explore, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. As I ventured deeper into the asylum, I stumbled upon an old, dusty ledger. It detailed the names of patients who had been admitted, along with notes about their treatments. The further I read, the more disturbing the entries became. Patients subjected to cruel experiments, lobotomies, and electroshock therapy. The asylum was a place of nightmares. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened closer, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound, drawn towards a room at the end of the hallway. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was hit by an overwhelming sense of fear. Inside, the walls were covered in scratch marks, and the floor was littered with broken glass and rusty chains. In the center of the room was an old metal bed, its restraints still intact. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight flickering, but there was no one there. Panic set in, and I decided it was time to leave. As I retraced my steps through the dark corridors, I could feel an unseen presence following me. The whispers continued, now accompanied by faint, ghostly apparitions that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. When I finally reached the entrance, I was out of breath and drenched in sweat. I burst through the doors and ran to my car, not daring to look back. As I sped away from the asylum, the whispers faded, but the sense of dread lingered. Once I returned home, I couldn't shake the events of that night. I found myself obsessively researching the history of Danvers State Hospital. Built in 1878, it was originally intended to house patients suffering from mental illnesses. However, over the decades, the asylum became notorious for its inhumane treatment methods. Stories of patients being chained to their beds, subjected to experimental surgeries, and enduring relentless physical and mental abuse were commonplace. What I discovered next sent shivers down my spine. In 1926, there was a mass breakout where several patients vanished without a trace. The hospital covered up the incident, claiming that the patients had simply wandered off and died in the surrounding woods. However, local legends suggested a far more sinister explanation. It was said that the spirits of those who had perished within the asylum's walls sought vengeance, tormenting anyone who dared to enter their domain. Despite my initial terror, a part of me was drawn back to the asylum. I needed answers. Why had I been targeted? What was the source of those whispers? Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to return to the asylum, this time with a more methodical approach. I gathered a few essential supplies, a high-powered flashlight, a voice recorder, and a notebook to document any findings. On a crisp November evening, I set out for the asylum once more. As I approached the gate, the familiar sense of dread returned. This time, however, I was prepared. I switched on my voice recorder and stepped inside. The atmosphere was even more oppressive than before, as if the very air was charged with malevolence. I made my way back to the room where I had first heard the whispers. As I entered, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I began asking questions aloud, hoping to capture any responses on the recorder. Who are you? Why are you here? What happened to you? My voice echoed in the empty room, but there was no immediate response. Just as I was about to give up, the whispers returned, louder and more urgent than before. This time I could make out a few words. Help. Us. Trapped. My heart raced as I tried to maintain my composure. I continued to ask questions, and the responses grew more coherent. The spirits spoke of their suffering, their desperation, and their desire for justice. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and died. Plunged into darkness, I fumbled to replace the batteries, my hands shaking. As I did, I felt a cold, clammy hand grasp my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to document everything. I managed to get the flashlight working again and resumed my investigation. The spirits revealed more details about the breakout in 1926. They claimed that the patients had been murdered by the hospital staff and their bodies hidden in a secret underground chamber. The spirits were bound to the asylum, unable to move on until their remains were found and given a proper burial. Determined to help them, I began searching for any clues that might lead me to the hidden chamber. Hours passed as I scoured the asylum, my every step accompanied by the relentless whispers. Finally, in a forgotten corner of the basement, I discovered a hidden door concealed behind a stack of old crates. It led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended deep into the earth. As I made my way down, the air grew colder and the darkness more oppressive. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a large, cavernous room filled with skeletal remains. The sight was both horrifying and heartbreaking. The spirits' whispers reached a crescendo, urging me to give them the peace they had long been denied. With a heavy heart, I gathered the remains and brought them back to the surface. I contacted the local authorities and informed them of my findings. The police conducted a thorough investigation and confirmed the gruesome truth. The bodies were given a proper burial, and a memorial was erected in their honor. In the weeks that followed, the whispers gradually faded. The spirits of the asylum had finally found peace. However, the experience left a lasting mark on me. I couldn't forget the terror I had felt or the suffering I had witnessed. To this day, I carry the memory of that night with me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most seemingly innocent places. The Danvers State Hospital was eventually demolished, and a new development was built on the site. But for those who know its history, the land remains a place of haunted memories. As for me, I have never returned to Danvers. The events of that night changed me forever, and I have no desire to revisit the horrors of the past. I've always loved driving at night. There's something peaceful about the dark, empty roads stretching endlessly before you, the hum of the engine a steady companion in the quiet. That night was no different. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital, 10 grueling hours in the ER, and all I wanted was the solace of the drive home. It was about a 2-hour drive through rural back roads, but I didn't mind. It was my time to unwind, to decompress. The clock on the dashboard glowed 12:03 a.m. as I merged onto the highway. The road was eerily empty, not a single car in sight. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the inky blackness ahead. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night talk show about UFO sightings. I laughed it off, not really paying attention, just needing some noise to keep me company. The road stretched out in front of me, winding through dense woods on either side. Tall, dark trees loomed over the asphalt, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the weak moonlight. I glanced at the fuel gauge, half full, enough to get home with plenty to spare. I adjusted my seat, settling in for the long haul. As I drove, the familiar landmarks passed by. A broken-down barn, an old wooden bridge, a roadside diner that had long since closed its doors. I'd driven this route so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. But something was different tonight. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. I kept driving, letting the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt soothe my nerves. I'd been on the road for about an hour when I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some shadow cast by the trees, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man, standing in the middle of the road. He was facing me, but I couldn't make out his features. He was just a silhouette, framed by my headlights. Instinctively, I slowed down, my heart skipping a beat. Who the hell stands in the middle of a highway at this time of night? I thought. I came to a stop about 10 feet from him, my car idling as I tried to figure out what to do. He didn't move. I honked the horn, a quick tap, trying to get his attention. He didn't react, just stood there, staring at me. Or at least, I think he was. I couldn't see his eyes. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I rolled down my window just a crack, enough to yell out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift. Every instinct screamed at me to drive around him, to get the hell out of there, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, so unnaturally still, like a statue. Then, slowly, he started walking toward me. His movements were stiff, jerky, like he wasn't used to his own limbs. He took one step, then another, each one echoing in the silence. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I felt trapped, like a deer caught in the headlights, unable to move. As he got closer, I could see him more clearly. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his frame in shreds. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was something wrong with his face, like it didn't fit right, like it had been stretched too tight over his skull. He was only a few feet away now, and I could see his eyes, wide, unblinking, and completely black. Panic surged through me. I slammed the car into reverse, my foot hitting the gas pedal hard. The tires screeched as I backed away, the man still walking toward me, unfazed. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from him. But then he stopped. Just as suddenly as he'd started, he stopped, standing in the middle of the road again, watching me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I floored the gas, swerving around him and speeding down the road. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing after me, but the road was empty. I tried to convince myself that it was just some deranged hitchhiker, maybe a drunk who had wandered too far from town. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I drove for what felt like hours, the dark road stretching out endlessly before me. I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the road again, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I turned the radio off, the silence in the car almost suffocating. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I needed to get home, to be somewhere safe. But as I drove, I started to notice something strange. The road wasn't right. I'd driven this route 100 times, but suddenly, nothing looked familiar. The landmarks I knew, the old barn, the wooden bridge, the diner, they were all gone. In their place were dark, twisted trees and a road that seemed to wind on forever. I must have taken a wrong turn, I thought, but that didn't make sense. There were no turns, no intersections, just a straight shot from the hospital to my house. Yet here I was, on a road I didn't recognize, in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over, the car coming to a stop on the gravel shoulder. I reached for my phone, desperate for some GPS guidance. But when I unlocked the screen, it was dead. No signal, just static. My heart sank. I was completely alone, lost in the middle of nowhere with no way to contact anyone. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I just needed to retrace my steps, find my way back to the main road. I turned the car around, heading back the way I'd come. The road was just as empty, just as dark. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like claws, scratching at the sides of the car. I pressed on, my eyes scanning the road for anything familiar, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell anymore. Time seemed to stretch, the night never ending. I was starting to feel like I was driving in circles, the same twisted trees passing by again and again. My mind was playing tricks on me, distorting everything into a nightmare. And then I saw him again, standing in the middle of the road, just like before. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same man. Same tattered clothes, same pale skin, same black eyes. He hadn't moved an inch from where I'd last seen him. But something was different this time. There were more of them. They stood beside him, figures emerging from the darkness. Men, women, children, all with the same pale skin and black eyes, all standing perfectly still, watching me. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't go back, and I couldn't go forward. They had me trapped. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. They were blocking the road, a wall of silent, unmoving figures. And then they started walking toward me. Fear overtook me. I slammed the car into reverse again, tires spinning on the gravel as I backed away. But it was no use. They were coming from all directions now, emerging from the woods, surrounding the car. Their faces were blank, devoid of emotion, their eyes locked on me. I could hear their footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel as they closed in. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I threw the car into drive, gunning the engine. The tires screamed as they caught traction, and I shot forward, aiming for a gap between the figures. They didn't move, didn't flinch as I barreled toward them. But just as I was about to break through, they were gone. 1 second, they were there, and the next, the road was empty again, like they'd never been there at all. I sped through the space where they'd stood, heart pounding, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't slow down, I didn't look back, I just kept driving, the road blurring beneath me as I pushed the car to its limits. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care, as long as it was away from that place, away from them. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the road winding endlessly ahead. My eyes burned from the strain, my hands numb from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I was running on pure adrenaline, every nerve in my body on high alert. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I rounded a bend in the road, and there it was, The old wooden bridge, the diner, the familiar landmarks that told me I was back on the right track. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, relief flooding through me. But the relief was short-lived. As I crossed the bridge, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and my blood ran cold. They were there, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I floored the gas, the car lurching forward as I sped away, desperate to put as much distance between me and them as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still following me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I didn't stop until I reached home. I parked the car in the driveway, practically stumbling out of it in my haste to get inside. I locked the door behind me, bolting it shut, my heart still racing. I collapsed onto the couch, every muscle in my body trembling. I was safe now, I told myself. They couldn't get me here. But even as I sat there, trying to calm my frayed nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, blank, pale, watching me with those black, empty eyes. And even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. The roads aren't safe anymore, not at night. Not for me. And maybe not for you either. This story plays on the universal fear of being alone on a dark road, with a twist of the supernatural to heighten the tension. The pacing builds slowly, allowing the terror to creep in gradually, leading to a climax that leaves the protagonist and the reader with lingering fear. This happened in the early 2000s. I was taking my son Tyler on his first deer hunting trip. We live in East Texas, and I've been hunting these woods since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Up until then, it was always a peaceful outing, nothing out of the ordinary. But this trip, man, I still get the cold sweats just thinking about it. The weather was perfect for hunting. Tyler had just turned 13, and I figured it was time for him to learn the family tradition. We loaded up the truck after school on Friday and headed to our usual spot, a 2-hour drive to a secluded area on a large, privately owned ranch where we had permission to hunt. The owner's an old family friend, and we've been coming here for decades. We arrived just before sunset, giving us enough time to set up camp and go over the plan for the next day. Tyler was buzzing with excitement, talking about bagging the biggest buck in Texas. I smiled, remembering my first hunting trip with my dad. We had a simple dinner of beans and hot dogs cooked over the campfire and turned in early, aiming to be up before dawn to get to our blind. That's when things started to get weird. It must have been around midnight when I woke to Tyler shuffling in his sleeping bag. "Dad," he whispered, "you awake?" "I am now," I grumbled. "What's up, bud?" "I think I heard someone outside." I was about to brush it off as the wind or a small critter when I heard it too. A scraping, scrabbling sound, like a whole lot of something moving around outside. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, flashlight in hand. What I saw made my blood run cold. The ground around our campsite was covered in tracks, hundreds of them, all coyote from the look of it. Coyotes aren't uncommon here, but I'd never seen so many in one place. And there were dark patches on the ground that looked suspiciously like blood. I tried to stay calm for Tyler's sake. "Just some coyotes passing through," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They're more scared of us than we are of them." But as I zipped up the tent, I felt uneasy. Something was definitely off. We tried to sleep, but the night was alive with sounds, rustling in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. Then, around 3 a.m., it started. The howling. I've heard coyotes howl before, but this was different. It started as a low whimper and built into the most gut-wrenching, pain-filled cries I've ever heard. It sounded like dozens, maybe hundreds of animals crying out in agony. Tyler was shaking, and so was I. We huddled in the tent, listening to those terrible cries for what felt like hours. I kept my rifle close, though I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was out there. Finally, as dawn began to break, the cries faded away. We must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, the sun was up. I'd love to say we packed up and left right then. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I guess I was trying to salvage the trip for Tyler, or maybe I was just fooling myself. How about we do a little scouting? I suggested over breakfast, which neither of us had much appetite for. Maybe we'll find a good spot for tomorrow's hunt. Tyler nodded, but I could see he was still spooked. Truth be told, so was I. We packed some water and snacks and headed out. I told myself it would be a short hike, an hour or two, then we'd head back and decide what to do next. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. We'd been walking for maybe 45 minutes when Tyler stopped dead in his tracks. "Dad, what's that smell?" he asked, holding his nose. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it hit me like a truck. The stench of death, so strong it made my eyes water. "Stay behind me," I told Tyler, raising my rifle. We moved forward slowly, following that awful smell. We pushed through dense undergrowth and found ourselves in a small clearing. That's when we saw it. I've been trying to make sense of it ever since, but what we saw in that clearing was like something from a nightmare. Coyotes, hundreds of them, hanging from the branches of the trees. But they weren't alive, nor were they whole. They'd been skinned, their raw flesh gleaming wetly in the dappled sunlight. Some were fresh, blood still dripping onto the forest floor. Others were in various stages of decay. The smell was overwhelming. I heard Tyler retch behind me, and I wasn't far behind. But the worst part, the worst, was the eyes. Every single skinned coyote still had its eyes, and I swear they were looking right at us. I don't remember much after that. I know I grabbed Tyler and ran. We crashed through the woods, not caring about direction, just desperate to get away from that clearing. By some miracle, we found our way back to the campsite. We didn't stop to pack up. I just grabbed the keys and my wallet and got in the truck. I don't think I've ever driven so fast. We were home before noon, and I spent the rest of the day holding my wife and trying not to fall apart. We never went back for our gear, never reported what we saw because when I told it to myself, it just sounded too bizarre. And who would have believed us anyway? I told the ranch owner we'd had a stomach bug and had to leave early. He knew I was lying, but he didn't press the issue. About 6 months later, I ran into my old hunting buddy Garrett at the hardware store. We got to talking, and I don't know why, but I found myself telling him what happened, though not in detail, just that we had a scary experience at the ranch, and I wasn't sure I'd be going back. Garrett went quiet, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in close. "I never told anyone this, but something weird happened to me out there too, maybe 5 years ago." Garrett said he'd been hunting alone one night when he saw something in the sky. 3 lights arranged in a triangle, hovering silently over the trees. They stayed there for about 10 seconds, then there was a flash so bright it left him seeing spots. When his vision cleared, the lights were gone. "I told myself it was some kind of military craft," Garrett said, convinced myself I was imagining things. But the next morning, I found hundreds of tracks around my campsite. Looked like coyote or dog prints. There was a weird smell too, like ozone or rotting meat. Garrett said he packed up and left immediately. I couldn't bring myself to put it into words, but as he spoke, I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. Whatever happened to those coyotes, whatever made those gut-wrenching cries that night, it wasn't natural, and I don't believe it was human. Tyler and I don't talk about it, not to each other or anyone else. I still hunt, not at the ranch, but in other places where the worst thing you have to worry about is twisting an ankle or startling a snake. But I'm always watching now, always listening. These days the howl of a coyote in the distance makes my heart skip a beat. To all you fellow hunters out there, be careful, watch the sky, and if you ever find yourself in the East Texas woods and hear coyotes crying out in pain, run, run and don't look back. My name is Michael Grant, a 32-year-old freelance photographer. I've spent years chasing the perfect shot, wandering through abandoned places, capturing the forgotten corners of the world. But nothing could have prepared me for the horror that awaited me in the remote town of Stonehaven, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. I had heard whispers of the town's dark past, tales of strange disappearances, and a place where the very walls seemed to breathe. Stonehaven wasn't on any map, and those who knew of it refused to speak its name. Intrigued by the mystery, I made it my mission to uncover the truth behind the legends. The road to Stonehaven was a narrow, winding trail that cut through the dense forest. Trees loomed overhead like ancient sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as if to ensnare me. My car's headlights struggled to pierce the thick fog that clung to the ground, reducing visibility to mere feet. As I approached the town, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The town itself seemed to materialize out of the mist, a collection of crumbling buildings and sagging roofs. There was no sign of life, no movement, only the unsettling quiet. I parked my car outside what appeared to be an old inn, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. The wooden sign creaked in the wind, barely legible. Stonehaven Inn. Stepping out of the car, I was struck by the stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and headed towards the inn, the creaking of the wooden porch the only sound in the night. The door to the inn groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The lobby was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long shadows across the worn furniture. A figure emerged from the darkness, a hunched old man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed too large for his skull. He regarded me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Welcome to Stonehaven," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "What brings you to our little town?" "I'm a photographer," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've heard stories about this place and wanted to see it for myself." The innkeeper's expression darkened. "You'd be better off leaving while you still can," he warned. "Stonehaven isn't a place for outsiders." But I was determined. I needed to know what secrets this town held. I pressed him for more information, but he refused to say anything further. Instead, he handed me a rusty key and pointed me towards a room at the end of the hall. As I made my way to the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walls seemed to close in on me, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The door to my room creaked as I opened it, revealing a small, musty space with a single bed and a cracked mirror. I set my camera on the bedside table and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up to me. But sleep didn't come easy. The silence was too complete, too unnatural. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the wall behind me, a steady, deliberate tapping that grew louder with each passing second. I grabbed my camera and crept towards the wall, my breath catching in my throat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I returned to bed, though sleep eluded me. The tapping haunted my thoughts, a sinister reminder that I was not alone in this place. The next morning, I decided to explore the town, hoping to find some clue to explain the strange events of the night before. The streets were empty, the buildings in various states of disrepair. It was as if the town had been abandoned in a hurry, left to rot in the elements. I wandered through the narrow alleys, my camera capturing the desolation. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I could sense eyes on me, hidden in the shadows, tracking my every move. I stumbled upon an old church, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. The doors were ajar, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust. Rows of pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in a thick layer of cobwebs. As I raised my camera to take a picture, I heard it again, the tapping, louder this time, coming from beneath the floor. I froze, my pulse quickening. The sound was persistent, insistent, as if demanding my attention. I knelt down and brushed away the debris, revealing a trapdoor hidden beneath the dust. My hands trembled as I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave this cursed place before it was too late. But curiosity got the better of me. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase led to a small subterranean chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved into the stone with a precision that was almost unnerving. In the center of the room was a stone slab, and on it lay a weathered, leather-bound journal. I reached for the journal, my fingers brushing against the cold leather. As I opened it, a gust of wind howled through the chamber, extinguishing the small lantern I had brought with me. I was plunged into darkness, the tapping sound returning, now deafening in its intensity. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to illuminate the pages of the journal. The writing was faded, barely legible, but I could make out fragments. A warning, a plea for help, and something about the silence. Before I could read further, I heard a low, guttural growl from the darkness. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized I was not alone in that chamber. I backed away slowly, the journal clutched in my hand, but the growling grew closer, more menacing. Without thinking, I bolted up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the creature behind me, its claws scraping against the stone. I didn't stop until I was back in the church, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. Breathing heavily, I leaned against the door, the journal still clutched in my hands. Whatever was down there, it was something far beyond my understanding, something ancient, malevolent, and very much real. Back in my room at the inn, I pored over the journal, desperate to make sense of what I had encountered. The entries were disjointed, written by someone clearly on the brink of madness. They spoke of the town's founding, of rituals performed in secret, and of a curse that had been placed upon Stonehaven. The final entry was the most chilling. The author wrote of a presence that had been awakened, something that fed on the silence, growing stronger with each passing day. They warned that anyone who heard the tapping was already marked, doomed to become part of the town's dark history. I was shaking as I closed the journal, the weight of what I had read pressing down on me. I needed to leave Stonehaven, and fast. But as I reached for my bag, I heard it again, the tapping, louder now, echoing through the walls. Panic set in. I grabbed my things and rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making the noise was desperate to reach me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the inn was silent, empty. Suddenly, the walls began to close in, the room shrinking around me. The tapping was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. I fell to the floor, my vision blurring as the walls pressed in tighter and tighter. And then, just as I thought I would be crushed, everything went silent. The walls receded, the door flew open, and I found myself alone in the room once more, gasping for breath. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my camera, the journal, and whatever else I could carry, and bolted out of the inn. The town was shrouded in darkness, the fog thicker than before. I ran towards my car, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, speeding down the narrow road that had brought me to this nightmare. As I drove, the tapping followed me, relentless, haunting. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing in the road behind me, their faces obscured by the fog. I didn't look back again. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I was exhausted, terrified, but I had made it out of Stonehaven. But the horror didn't end there. Even now, as I write this, I can still hear the tapping, faint but persistent, echoing in the back of my mind. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. If you ever hear of Stonehaven, if you ever find yourself drawn to its mysteries, turn back. Don't make the same mistake I did. Some places are meant to be forgotten, their secrets buried in the silence, and once you've heard the tapping, there's no escape.